Inspector Oldfield and the Black Hand Society tells the fascinating story of one of the first Italian crime organizations in the United States and the intrepid U.S. Postal Service inspector who brought them down. In the beginning of the last century, Italians across America were held in the grip of the Society of the Banana, also known as La Mano Negra, or the Black Hand. Their ruthless tactics and code of silence proved impossible for law enforcement officials to crack for years. That is, until Inspector Frank Oldfield came along, and the tenacious USPS inspector and his team of investigators boldly stood up to the crime ring and were able to prosecute the leaders, breaking the power of the Black Hand in the Midwest and giving hope to victims and law enforcement officials across the country. Now, William Oldfield is the great-grandson of Inspector John Frank Oldfield. He is an archivist and historical lecturer in Annapolis, Maryland. Victoria Bruce is the author of No Apparent Danger, Sellout, and Hostage Nation, and achieved the Columbia University Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism for her film The Kidnapping of Ingrid Betancourt. Tonight, we are very lucky that our two authors will be in conversation with Dan Mihalko, who is a former USPS inspector who managed the Prohibited Mailings program for many, many years. Without further ado, let's give a warm round of applause for our guests this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron, and thanks to all of you for showing up tonight. This is a pretty remarkable event for us in the Postal Inspection Service. It's not that often that we have books written about us. Not that many people know about us, so we're doing our best to make sure that everybody here is going to know who a postal inspector is and what a postal inspector does. And thanks to Politics and Prose for hosting it tonight. And this is what I want to see when you walk out tonight. A bag with books in, preferably the Oldfield book, but even more. Because this is an independent bookstore, and we want to make sure that these types of places stay in business. So certainly want you to support them. I'm really happy to see so many retired postal inspectors here and postal inspectors, and I would like them, the retired inspectors and the current postal inspectors, to stand up.
There we go.
I'm also a retired inspector, and before you get a chance to talk to any of those three retired inspectors back there, if they tell you that I worked with his great-grandfather, it's not true. I was not a postal inspector in 1909. I was in second grade then, so. Well, this has been a fascinating journey, especially for Bill and his sister Alison. And I'll start the whole conversation off with you, Bill. You've had this material for over 100 years. Why was there a reluctance to tell this fascinating story?
Well, I'm nervous. I'm very nervous. Obviously, this is off, so let's just say right now.
That's on.
Can you hear it? Can you hear that? I don't see any faces that I recognize in here right now, so I think I can make it to the car safely. We were honestly afraid of retaliation, and we also wanted to show respect because many of the descendants had become extremely prominent and successful in the community and across the United States, and we thought that we'd try to show some respect for them. And eventually decided when we tell the story, it had to be nonfiction. It had to be absolutely positively the researched truth. So that way no one could embellish and no one could say we ever tried to show favoritism or lack of thereof.
Well, when I met Bill, and I guess it was about 2002, he came with a lot of material like you see over here. So after we're done with our presentation, please feel free to come up here and peruse some of the material that he brought. Well, when Bill showed up at my place, he brought this. I said, Bill, what are you doing with this in the post office? You can't have this kind of stuff here. Interesting thing about this was a knife that his great-grandfather took off one of the suspects and the defendants in the case. And the interesting thing about it, it's just not a knife. The handle is made out of human bone. So when Bill talks about the reluctance to really tell the story, and there was real concern, you can see why. Because I'm pretty sure this is not your bone, right?
No, I'm okay tonight, so far.
Now, Vicki, whenever Just a little background on how these guys met. As I said, I've known Bill for a long time, and he's been trying to sell this story to somebody for a long time. He started with me, and I didn't have any money to buy it. So, but he's done a good job of putting all the things together. But there was that one missing link. He wasn't able to get somebody to actually write it until he ran into somebody. It was at a coffee shop in
Is
Annapolis.
that a coffee shop in Annapolis?
Yeah, he ran into a lady that was sitting there at the coffee shop on a laptop, and he said, "Geez, she has a laptop. Maybe she's a writer." And lo and behold, she was. So, Vicky, what happened whenever this guy shows up and he brings his trunk, actual trunk of material?
Well, I didn't see the trunk at first.
Oh,
Okay,
that would have scared you off.
Yeah, the first line was, "Hey, I got this great idea for a book." You know, and if you're a writer, you've probably heard that 100 times.
Maybe.
But I love stories, so I would listen anyway, and you know, usually be very kind and say, "Well, you should write that. That's a great idea." So Bill starts talking, and he's talking about, "Oh yeah, my great grandfather, he busted the first organized crime ring in America. No one knows about it. Was in 1909, you know, before Prohibition and Al Capone, and I have like 2,000 documents in a safe deposit box and in my apartment sitting in boxes, and I'm like drooling, right? I'm like, are you kidding me? You know, so like I instantly wanted to grab him, but I was trying to play it cool. Like, oh, that would be cool. Maybe I could work on that someday with you. And so at that moment, I was hooked. And then it took me 4 years to convince him. His sister Alison, if you wouldn't mind standing up, this is the other great daughter, the only great granddaughter in the room of Frank Oldfield as well. So at one point I had an interview with the two of them, and I'm like, okay, what do I say so they want me? In the end, obviously, I was able to convince both Alison and Bill that I was the one to write this book. So I'm very lucky.
And how do you start? I mean, you had so much material. Where do you even begin on a project like this?
Well, it was in Bill's entire Jeep. If I call him Hammy, that's his middle name and his nickname. So Hammy comes over and he's got these big cases and he just dumps them with me. And his great grandmother, Frank's wife, had archived every single newspaper clipping ever about her husband at the time. So like thousands and thousands of names and Salvatores everywhere and big mustaches and Bertillon cards and, you know, you just name it. I mean, there's so much information, it was overwhelming. So I took all the bad guys and I made big pictures of them. And I have to thank my hairdresser, who's also my husband, and my daughter, and my friend Dawn, who lives with us. And we had them all over the wall in a rogues gallery so I could learn these guys. And that's how I started, was just getting to know my characters.
But it really starts, which she understood then, was around 8 years old for us, as Alison and I, 8 or 9 years old. And having a great collection is one thing. After waiting for the right people to pass away in your family and getting permission to continue with it, what's the next thing you do? Well, in 2002, after my mother passed, I knew about the boxes. I'd seen them a couple times during my life. I found out that they really don't tell the story. Half the names are wrong. Some of them are actually inverted. The reporters had a terrible time, and of course they sensationalized everything. So how much of it was really true? And that's where the research started, and the process of talking to people like Dan Mihalko, the Smithsonian, other people, the U.S. archives that let me wander their shelves and rooms completely without any supervision whatsoever, if you can believe it. I think that maybe I have a believable face or something, I don't know. But that was fun, by the way, opening boxes that I shouldn't, things like that. And finally it got to a point where I had outlines and stacks of different types of research, but I'm a consultant, and I write technical solutions. Who wants to read the great Britannica Mafia Bible? So, so you have to find somebody who, she's also a geologist, so she has a technical background as well, but she has this ability to take all this information and let's craft a story around it. It reads like nonfiction, reading like fiction, and that makes it even more fun. And then, of course, we debated and collaborated
A little bit.
to get the book done. Sorry, I slipped there, didn't I? And it's amazing, the editing process, by the way. is hell. If you decide to be a writer and you're working with an editor, how many times? How many hours? No, straight, where you just run.
It was a piece of cake.
Oh, you liar.
Well, Bill, your grandfather had a pretty spectacular career, and as you mentioned about the media, there were some guidelines back for postal inspectors in that day where you really were pretty much told, don't talk to the media. But old Frank Oldfield apparently didn't get that directive, because not only did he talk about Frank Oldfield, but he talked about the Postal Inspection Service, and his media relations were so good that he got everybody believing in the work that he was doing. Tell us a little bit about how he became a postal inspector. It was a little bit different back in those days as opposed to some of my colleagues here, where we took a test and we went through an academy. There was a lot of politics involved back then, wasn't there?
Yeah, I'm sorry to disappoint all of you, but I think Vicky was surprised as well. We have this reverence now for people that reach that level of security clearance, that level of trust in fiduciary trust in the in our government and in our private lives as well. And I think it even shocked Vicky that it was a political appointment through and through. If you were on one party, you got appointed. If you were in the other party, they started putting pressure on getting you to resign or somehow not get some sort of improved position in your career. And it was tough. Now, they bonded you like they bond people today, something like clearance, right? But it was certainly who you knew, really was.
So Frank was just 29. He got that appointment as a sheriff, right, of Ellicott City, Maryland. So the story actually starts in Ellicott City. And you sort of realize what a rogue Frank is from the beginning. He's constantly in trouble. Makes it through as a sheriff for a short time, and then his father pulls strings. They were a prominent family in Ellicott City, so his father pulled the strings, and here he is marching off in the really the most powerful law enforcement job in the nation, with like half a year as a sheriff as a background in law enforcement. So, but he was very successful.
Vic, you're probably like everybody else in this room except for the inspectors. You never heard of a postal inspector before Bill showed up, did you?
Barely, but I really had no idea of the power and the reach and the cases that were solved, like anthrax and Unabomber, and and then I recently met another inspector, and it's mind-boggling how much you guys do, and it's incredible. So the powers of the Postal Inspection Service have not changed since Frank's day. But there's not until Dan Mihalko came along, there wasn't as good a publicist for them.
By the way, I arrested all those guys you mentioned. Bill, tell us a little bit about the Black Hand. I mean, that's what this is all about. Not only your great-grandfather investigating them, but this is a pretty interesting organization. Most of us remember gangsters and the Mafia through the Godfather movies, and we remember the stories about Al Capone and Lucky Luciano and then the New York Mafia in the 60s. What about these guys? These guys were the real deal. They were probably the first criminals that had the name or the description of a terrorist attached to them.
They were the fathers and grandfathers of the Al Capones. They came from the old country, mainly from Sicily, following the mass Italian immigration post-Civil War, and used the moniker, the Black Hand, or the Hand of Death, to prey upon the Italian business community and sadly to prey upon some of their ignorance or their their superstition from the old country, or their lack of the language barrier they had, so they could go nowhere. They couldn't talk to the police. And they operated simply but elegantly. They had a sophisticated internal organization. Most people thought they were just a local gang of thugs in any individual city. And Frank was able to first identify that they had become more sophisticated, like the modern mob we think of, or Russian mafia, any other mafia that we have today. But previously, like I said, simply, elegantly, you create a letter, you invent a terrible, terrible punishment, You extort the money from businesses. They don't pay the first or second time, so you kidnap someone's wife, cut their hand off, cut their head off, slash them, bomb their buildings, destroy their business, whatever, and eventually the word gets out that you probably should pay. They were very, very violent. In fact, sometimes you talk to mafiosos of today or people that say they know them, and they say, we're nothing compared to those guys. They were afraid of those guys, to give you an idea. The old school, the guys from the old school.
So Bill, you're just talking about these tremendously violent crimes. So what took law enforcement so long to actually take some action?
Like Vicky and I were able to confirm. I mean, there's family lore about that no one believed that they existed, that sort of thing. And we didn't really know that until we truly did the research even deeper to find out that federal law enforcement, state, county, thought they were local bands of thugs. They didn't think that they were organized, And when Frank was able to determine and prove through his casework that they were spread across the United States, many of them related to one another, by the way, through marriage or whatever, and sort of franchising their operation, that really was able to cause the development of the case and to break the case in the future.
And one of the things that held everybody back, of course, was the reluctance of witnesses.
Yeah.
How did he overcome that?
Now, this is before Miranda, everybody. I think we all know that, where we get read our rights if we do something wrong, and we have certain protections. There was some leeway, a small amount of investigative freedom. I don't know what you want to call it. And, sometimes it took a little blackjack, a little leather with some shotgun shot in it, or maybe an arm twisting. But the witnesses were just as difficult to convince to squeal as the bad guys were to get them to talk. But little by little.
I mean, I think that Hammy's leaving out, Frank was a smooth operator. I mean, he could be so charming that one guy who he put in prison ended up just falling in love with him and writing him letters from prison. I mean, and sending the family like a gift and give Christmas cards and gifts in the mail. And there's even an article in, I think it was the New York Times about that. It said, burglar Jim wanted to have Oldfield's scalp. But, he was, even though he couldn't stand it, that he was, he liked him so much, but he just never in the back of his mind, he always wanted to kill him, but he just couldn't help but like him. So that's our character, Frank. So there was a lot of sweet talking.
You're right.
Manipulation.
Let's be honest, right? He's a flawed person like we all are. He can be a charmer when he wants to be. He can be argumentative. He can beat the you-know-what out of somebody if he wants to. And I'm surprised because I'm about the same size. And I think I could take on a few people, but I don't know if I take on the assistant district attorney of the city of New York in front of everybody. Or take on burglar Jim with your kid sitting in the back seat of your Model T. I don't know where he got that. So charm, yes, but there was something else inside of him, and I don't know where it came from, but I hope it continues in our DNA.
This is for the two of you. What little sidebar type story that you uncovered while you were putting this whole project together? What jumps out? You got any little stories that were not necessarily involved with the whole thing here?
Well, Hammy talks about family lore a lot, and that's what really pulled me in, because he just has so much passion for his family and the story. And but a lot of them were incorrect when I found them. So one of them it's a lynching that happened in Ellicott City, and the story that Hammy told me was that Frank, there was a guy, he murdered another guy that was, sort of obvious, everyone knew, and he was convicted, but the judge ordered that he be evaluated by a doctor before being hung. And maybe instead, maybe he's mentally ill and incompetent. He shouldn't be hung. He could just do life in prison. Well, everyone was just furious in Ellicott City, especially the Democrats, which were also the White Caps, some of them, and the KKK. And they said, well, we want him dead. And Frank went out there and he guarded the prison. It's the jail.
With Clarence,
he guarded
his
the
brother.
jail with his brother all night long, day after day, so that this man would not be lynched. And he did not believe in the death penalty. So the story in the family was that he was saved. And I found out that that wasn't true. So that was very sad. But some of those stories, and it's like, going back to Hammy and saying it wasn't that way. It's a really sad story, but it also shows Frank's personality. He was so doggedly trying to help this guy. Finally, thought the mob frenzy died down. He wasn't guarding him one night, and then that's the day they broke him out of jail and hung him from a tree up the street. So
That's the problem with nonfiction. You see that? No. We decided to tell the truth, made my mother a promise before she passed, and darn it, but the lynching did happen, and we weren't happy about that when we found that out. I told my sister, and it kind of crushes one because we had this idyllic image of our great grandfather, and every time we found out, we knew he'd cause trouble now and then. We understood that, but everybody overlooks that when the person gets their man, runs their bad guy to earth, as he said. But that did surprise Vicky and I over and over to find each of these things out that. I guess the story was bent just a little bit for a couple hundred or 100 years,
Well, I think it's probably time to open it up to questions that you folks might have. So if you have a question for Bill or Vicky, hop up to the microphone there and let's hear it.
Hi there. I was wondering if any of the people that they had targeted ever attempted to fight back or retaliate.
Well, we'll start out initially. There were a couple times. We kept the secret quiet enough for long enough, I think, that by the time World War II came around, right around that time, people did not know exactly who we were anymore. But out of safety in the family, we continued after that through another generation and a half. But we go back to Burglar Jim, have a little fun here. By the way, that copper box there was taken out of Burglar Jim's hands. That's the inside of a postal safe, or just one of the drawers inside of the postal safe. Burglar Jim wanted to kill my great-grandfather. He also threatened his other fellow inspectors, George Pate and Edward Hutchess, and some other guys from the Cincinnati and Columbus area. But I think, as Vicky said before, Oldfield was a charmer. He schmoozed him a little. I think he got him to finally come around, and Christmas cards started going back and forth. And that happened to more than one threatening situation. But then we get to the Black Hand case. Some of those families,
Well,
hopefully Vicky will elaborate.
One of the characters, he sees a very sad and violent ending. So I'm not going to say who that is, but there was a retaliation actually to one of the people that was instrumental in putting them away in prison.
And we had throughout Ohio, since we stayed in Ohio, the Oldfield family, we have some relatives who are from the ethnicity close to the bad guys, but they weren't bad guys in that family. And so we had to be very careful. These descendants of these Black Handers, some of them went to private business and kind of cleaned up their act with lots of money, and they were able to invest and buy lots of land, that kind of thing. Yeah, but other ones, they continued in the business all the way up until maybe even right now.
Sir?
Well, this is probably the least important or least relevant question you'll get tonight, hopefully so. But for some reason, I just can't let it go, so I'd like to know the answer. At the introduction, did I understand it correctly that the Black Hand was also known as the Banana Society? Can you explain that? Go ahead.
So our Black Hand was sort of a term that was used as the Mafia between the turn of the century and for about a decade. And nobody knows the real origin, but it was probably that somebody had signed one of these letters as a Black Hand. A journalist got a hold of it, promoted it, Black Hand crime. Then all the mafiosos started calling that they weren't calling themselves Mafia. They started saying, well, we're the Black Hand. So now every letter was the Black Hand. Every group of Mafia Sicilians were the Black Hand. So not only are our guys, we call them Black Handers or the Black Hand, this particular group in our book that Frank busts is the Society of the Banana. That's their internal name. They called themselves because they were all fruit importers and distributors.
Okay. There we
So when we have the actual letters in between mobsters that say, "Don't send any more banana bills because the buzzards are coming for the shipment." I mean, literally, they
Right.
use like fruit terms, so it's very cool. So it is the Society of the Banana, and the head guy is named Sam Lehman, and you're going to learn a lot about him. He's quite a character.
He called it, Sam Lehman, his brother-in-law called themselves, if you look at the Lehman brothers, the Banana Kings. And some of the letters internally, they're all in code. They're all in Sicilian dialect anyway. But then they go deeper and say, we're not going to steam the bananas this Friday. It will be next Friday when we steam the bananas. What's that? Maybe have a meeting? And watch out for the buzzards, for they might get you. Maybe those are cops or maybe postal inspectors. Yeah. But there's a lot of fun that makes you laugh in this, but they took it deadly seriously.
Hello. I have a two-part question. How long before you think Scorsese jumps on your book? And
Do you have his number?
yeah. And the second one is how active do you think? I know with the internet thing, and they say a lot of the mafia is very corporate now, and a lot of sort of behind the scenes. I was wondering how active you think the mafia is still today, and
You have a great voice to read the book.
yeah.
On the Audible.
We'd like to do the Audible contract that we're working. Okay.
Totally, I love it.
It sounds like a little bit of, there's a little wise guy in this guy. Oh, boy. Okay. Well, the mafia is mainly based ethnically. So you just have to look at it candidly. And that's what's difficult about writing it with, the political correctness. There's the Jewish mafia, the Russian mafia, the Mexican. I mean, they kind of stick together as an ethnic group, and they all kind of pick their own trade. So I'll give you a quick example. In the drug trade from Mexico right now, you have a modern group calling themselves a cartel, the Black Hand. And they also add, besides their drug work, they do some of the machetes and some of the pretty nasty stuff. I think it's never going to go away. You're always going to have an organized crime, as long as there's an easy way to make lots of money with very low overhead, very low cost of doing business. It's just that simple.
Do you think the violence is cut down though, just because there's so many different ways to catch people now, just with the intelligence community? I mean, do you think there's still a level of violence out there, or do you think that's cut down a little bit?
No, I don't think the level of violence has been cut down at all. No, I think there's a lot more serious violent type crime out there now. But there's a lot of good law enforcement agencies, including postal inspectors, that are tackling it. Yeah. So it's not like it's worse than it was, but I don't think it's been minimized that much either.
Okay. Well, thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Right.
Frank Oldfield might say differently. They wiped out the Black Hand.
You started by saying that postal inspectors are the most powerful. So what is a postal inspector? Where does the authority come from? What do you do?
Are you allowed to tell her exactly what you guys do? You are retired, so no.
A general.
A postal inspector, we trace our history all the way back to Benjamin Franklin. He was when he was postmaster of Philadelphia, he was given additional duties of monitoring post offices and bringing the officers into account, which is kind of like the forerunner of what the postal inspector does today. But we enforce over 200 federal statutes that deal with the mail, deal with the postal service. We're responsible for protecting over half a million postal employees and 30-some thousand facilities. And we do all kinds of things, all kinds of postal crimes we investigate that involve the mail. So whatever, like these guys, what they were doing,
these guys get into it?
They were mailing stuff. So you put a stamp on it and it goes through the mail. That's our jurisdiction. It includes mail fraud, people stealing mail, mail theft, violence against postal employees. We do a lot of things in what are called prohibited mails. Things that you can't mail, like bombs, narcotics, extortion cases like the Black Hand.
So the people were mailing those packages a while ago, mailing them to tech people or something.
Well, I like to put it this way. As long as there's been mail, there's been somebody trying to steal it. and we've been going after those guys.
So what, has email destroyed your?
No, interestingly enough, that's a good question. Is our workload going down because of email? Not really, because what happens with a lot of the email and internet transactions, there's a mail component to it. So if somebody's ordering something online, it has to get delivered. Good question.
Dan, I really enjoy how in the digital age, how the Postal Inspection Service, it's been married with the digital age. As the paper goes away, the communication doesn't. And as the communication continues, the statutes continue to apply. And so that's why we say they have such a broad authority. It just keeps growing in that sense,
I was wondering, when you described postal inspectors' mission and their level of influence and how it's held steady from the time of the Black Hand up till now, it occurred to me that the tools of the trade have evolved in many great ways. So the work must have changed in great ways. Like today, postal inspectors can detect anthrax or detect bombs by way of forensic technologies or things like that they clearly didn't have in the time of the Black Hand. So I wonder what kinds of tools of the trade could they rely on back then? If they didn't have the high technology of today, what did they have at hand to be able to track down these guys?
Well, one thing we're really lucky to see in the Postal Inspection Service today and in the past, they are groundbreaking on a regular basis, and there's some of the earliest pilot, beta testing of different technologies, especially right now in explosives detection. In the past, the instant a new technology came from France or investigated, like Alphonse Bertillon's concept of using physical attributes to identify somebody before the fingerprint came out, they adopted it immediately before it was even seen in other U.S. state and federal law enforcement. And each time, so the second one, for example, is they adopted the analysis of handwriting. And in this case, this is from what we have been able to discern, I won't make you that final promise, but that it's the very first time handwriting analysis was used to convict someone of a federal offense.
And each side had a handwriting analyst, the defense and the prosecution. And of course, they had different ideas of who wrote what.
I get the impression that the Postal Inspection Service is encouraging the Chinese to send fentanyl to some of the most bucolic places in the whole United States. But my question concerns the Bertillon system. Wasn't that an ID tool that measured distances on the faces of people before fingerprints were found to identify people? Could you go into that a little bit more lengthily, please?
I think that's better for you guys. But what he's talking about are these Bertillon cards that we actually have some here, the originals from our gangsters. And what they do is they have measurements. And I actually, as the author, co-writer, was able to use these to describe my guys. I didn't know they had a scar on their face, but then they mark every scar on your finger, an arm that doesn't move so well. So I was able to even sort of draw more of a physical characteristics by using these. You can see them over here.
The perfect character development tool, right? Even if we didn't have a photograph, John Frank's notes he had these little, they're about 3 inches wide by about 8.5 inches long. And they're a little note piece of paper. And you carry them around they fit in your suit jacket breast pocket. And if she didn't have Bertillon cards to work with for descriptions, or we had some of those little pieces of paper from when he first saw somebody or one of the other inspectors, and they would describe the person from sight and watch their behavior. And of course, later on, then the measurements were done that she's referring to.
Along that note, I just have to say, this is so cool. So we're going to, Hammy and I are going to have dinner in Ohio next week with the great-granddaughter of Sebastian Lima, one of the bad guys that Frank put away. Frank never, ever knew what Antonio Lima looked like. Her great-great-grandfather. I'm
driving separately. I would decide if I'm going on that dinner.
And the first time we ever saw it was because Melanie Butera sent us a picture of Antonio Lima. So we know what Antonio Lima looked like Frank could never find him or find a picture of him. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, he's the big fish that got away. But there were plenty of big fish out there. So if if one breaks the line, he gets the other one. But
His picture's in the book. I mean, you can't make these guys up. They do look like a Scorsese film. So,
Any other questions?
As long as nobody else is. When were fingerprints accepted generally in law enforcement?
go ahead, Dan.
I think it was in the late 30s, into the 40s. Postal inspectors developed one of the first crime labs in 1940. And as Bill said, we've been on the cutting edge of all new technology. So we have really one of the world-renowned crime labs right out of Dulles Airport.
Was it a factor, say, in the Lindbergh case, or are you unaware?
That I don't know. Okay. I didn't work that one.
Yeah, I wasn't born yet, and he was only about, I think, 5 or 6, weren't you?
I have a question here from Alison Oldfield.
Vicki and Ham, how did you manage to craft the entire story with so little evidence remaining? And can you go into a little bit about what happened to the evidence since 1909 and where it was?
I guess I'll go first on this one, so we know what happened to the evidence, and then Vicki can help me with how we got along so perfectly, and we did
Every minute
of it. Yes, and John Frank Oldfield had 7 steamer trunks of evidence for effect when he rolled into the trial in 1910. And this is all evidence. This wasn't just stuffed newspapers in there. This was the real stuff. I mean, so at the trial, I won't say what happened. You have to read the book. But after it's all said and done, he gets on the train and he takes all these steamer trunks home. And they ended up on North Congress Street in Athens, Ohio, by Ohio University. Well, little by little, over generation to generation, we are kind of a pack rat family, I'll admit it. The steamer trunks and the evidence went from one generation to the next. Well, little by little, the Hocking River in Athens wiped out a few basements. There goes a couple steamer trunks, down the river. And eventually it ended up being about the size of that hostess cart right there worth of stuff, about one steamer trunk. And it made it to us at about 8 or 9 years old for the first time. We got to take a quick peek at it and be completely amazed, handling it without gloves or anything. Just it was all over the floor with our relatives. It gets stuck in the trunk of a car, gets home, gets stuck in the attic, and we're not allowed to see it again. And that's it. Don't say anything about it, or bad things will happen to us. You don't know who lives next door, And right around high school, or junior high school at the time, we got to see it again. And that's kind of where this all began with the evidence. Now, when Vicki and I finally got together, I'd like you to address what you're...
So when Alison says that there wasn't that much evidence, there was way too much left over for me.
Maybe too much survived, okay, for her.
There are many more books in that one case that was left. In fact, over here is the actual indictment book. And there were 2, and you'll read about that in the book because the first one got thrown out. But I was completely overwhelmed. There is so much material. I cry thinking of what was in the other 6 trunks, but I really don't want it at this point.
All the stuff that was hidden behind the walls. What I want to know is what happened to all that stashed cash that was behind the walls.
Exactly.
We're still trying to figure it out.
We're going to get some ground penetrating radar and go back to Frank's house.
Well, thank all of you for coming. I think this was a pretty enlightening event here. I hope you are walking away. Oh, you have another question? All right, go ahead.
Decided to establish an intelligence division, and they picked a postal inspector, Elmer Irie, to head up the division. And a lot of movies about criminals like Al Capone, the Untouchables, and all that. Actually, Capone was sent away based on evidence obtained by a special agent who infiltrated his books and records and convicted him of tax evasion. And he spent quite a few years at Alcatraz. And then when he was released, he died in his estate in Miami, Florida. But Elmer Irie was the initial director of the Intelligence Division, and he was a postal inspector.
You're absolutely right. There were 6 postal inspectors were taken with him over to establish the IRS Criminal Investigations Division.
I was in that division.
All right.
Oh my gosh, thank you. We're getting a picture with you. You're my hero.
I spent 9 years on a loan to Interpol. It's an international police organization. So I traveled to Paris, to London, Bahamas, Jamaica.
All right, I want your job.
You're our next book. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you very
these
much.
guys wrote about history, but you lived it. So.
Thank you very much, sir.
My 96th birthday.
All right.
All right, we are getting your information. We are going to write a book about this guy.
Well, I hope you're walking away with a better understanding of. Oh, we have one more. Okay.
Well,
Never mind.
thank you for bringing this important story of history forward. I was wondering, is it represented in the Postal Museum, or will it be?
Do we flip a coin on that, Dan, or?
Some of it was. We have a new exhibit out at the National Postal Museum. It's called Behind the Badge. It's the 3rd exhibit, Postal Inspection Service memorabilia and history. And in the 2nd exhibit, it was called The Silent Service. We had some of Bill's great-grandfather's artifacts in the exhibit. And what happens with exhibits to make them zippier and have people keep coming back, you change it for over the years. So it's not in there now, but we have a 10-year deal with them, so there's a really good chance that we'll get it in there in the future again. Any other ones? Again, thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I hope you understand a little more about postal inspectors from the early 1900s. But if you want to learn about postal inspectors and what they do today, tune in tomorrow morning. The Inspectors on CBS Saturday morning. It's on the CBS network, and every Saturday morning you'll hear and you'll read and you'll listen to stories about postal inspectors and how they've combated these criminals out there, and you're going to learn a lot of educational crime prevention tips on how you don't become a victim. So,
And please,
I think it's on 11:30 here in DC on Channel 9.
also, it's very hard to get the word out about books these days. There's so much other news you might have heard of, but please tweet and Facebook and spread the word about our book. It's all word of mouth, and that'll be the way that we're going to bring this out and get that film deal for Frank.
We want Frank to make it to the silver screen. Margaret Galena always wanted that attention, that and all those society events, and he just couldn't get it for her. So if you can all help us, this is not fake news. This really happened. Okay.
Really happened.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. We're signing books up here.